probably a good idea to begin with. That's great. So thank you very much, everyone, for pitching up and enduring more Zoom meetings. So well done to you all. I'll just do a quick introduction and sort of explain how I'm involved in this and some of my thinking about it. The bulk of the presentation will be from John, who I'll briefly introduce before passing over to him in a couple of minutes' time. And then I'll just do a quick sort of tail thing, really, in terms of thoughts and provocations. But really interested in you thinking, helping us think this through. I think because we've had a whole variety of conversations about this particular project, but I thought it would be particularly interesting to get some of the kind of systems thinking from Schumacher deployed on this. So really welcoming ideas, thoughts, criticisms, opportunities, connections, any of that stuff in the questions. So my name is Martin Parker. I'm a professor at the University of Bristol, and I've got a kind of joint appointment in that I'm within the School of Management. But I also run a little research initiative called the Inclusive Economy Initiative, which is aimed at helping to tilt the city region economy towards low carbon, high inclusion, high democracy work. So we're involved in quite a lot of bits and pieces. I suppose one of the things I wanted to start off by saying is that my interest academically for many years has been in kind of alternative organizations. So I've been interested in co-ops and mutuals and partnerships and different ways of thinking about how organizing happens. And I'm particularly interested in ways that organizing gets distributed and can be thought of in more democratic and inclusive ways and so on. But since moving to Bristol about 4 years ago, I guess I've become sort of less interested in organizations themselves and more interested in the economic and social systems that they sit within, that organizations are incubated by. And particularly interested because a lot of my work now involves hanging around with various people in Bristol and the Bristol region in thinking about city systems and how those kinds of systems might be imagined. And particularly in terms of the sort of the entanglements of city systems. So, it's no surprise to you that we could think about a city in terms of a set of different systems that cover questions of transport or refuse or food or education or housing or whatever else. And what's kind of interesting me at the moment is the way in which teasing out problems from each one of those systems then reveals problems in another one. So trying to understand the kind of a really holistic understanding of what a city system might be. Now, as part of that, I've been involved in 2 projects which are really about citizen action and connecting. One of them is to try to help the City Council thinking through their citizen action platform, Can Do Bristol, which has got over 10,000 people on it now, volunteering in different sorts of ways for a whole variety of third sector organisations. The other project that I got involved in was John Manley's Asking Bristol project. I first met John, I think, at a university lunch just before he became High Sheriff about 2.5 years ago now, John, something like that. And he was telling me that he'd just been measured for his tights for his sheriff's uniform. And then we got talking about a variety of things. And then he, with his considerable charm and intelligence, entangled me in this Asking Bristol thing. But it's really John's project, to make that perfectly clear. All I'm doing is really sort of trying to think about ways in which the project can connect to the capacities and resources of one of the universities in the city, the one that I represent. John comes from a background in information systems and is an extraordinarily interesting thinker himself, in that I think he's a kind of natural systems thinker. And very often when we've been talking about the project, he's constructing these sorts of rather curious and always moving diagrams in which various sorts of components are being connected in slightly different ways in order to understand what it is we're doing. But basically what we're trying to construct is what John's rather beautifully calling a hyper-connected city, a way of thinking about connections in productive ways between third sector organizations, students and universities, and a whole variety of potential givers. with that, I think I'll just pass over to John. Was that okay as a kind of an intro, John? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin.
No problem. Pass over to John. I'll mute and then I'll come back in again when he's finished.
So I'm going to share some slides. There might seem to be quite a lot of them, but they'll go quite quickly. So, oops. I think I might have been disabled from sharing, Ian.
Sorry, John,
That's it.
getting back out and came in again. Yes, right. You should be away now.
Yep, I'm away now. So what I'm going to talk about is democratizing asking and giving in Greater Bristol. So what we're effectively using is Greater Bristol as an experimental test bed. So next 23 minutes, what I'm going to do is talk about these subjects, and I'll start off with some observations that led me into this thinking. So we're talking really about the third sector here, and the third sector is ever more critical to the functioning of this country. It's ever more critical to the functioning of cities and regions and towns and communities. And it is a market. It's not always thought of as a market, but it is a market. But it's also a market that's seen very few disruptions over recent decades. And it is interesting to ask whether, because there have been so few disruptions, whether it's become an oligopoly. And one very telling statistic comes from UK community foundations. And the community foundations try to match local giving with local asking. Their statistic is that over 80% of the income of the charitable sector in this country goes to just 4% of the charities, which is an absolutely amazing statistic. So, when I was High Sheriff of the County of City of Bristol, which was 2020 to 2021, I effectively had to be a virtual High Sheriff, as most of the events were no longer physical. But what that meant was I could do 3 times as many as I normally would do. So I had 840 visits and meetings, mostly held on Zoom. And this was an opportunity to explore Bristol in much greater depth and breadth. And there were 2 early experiences that were formative. The first one came from the High Sheriff's Fund, and we worked with neighbourhood policing for a small part of this fund to be given out in small amounts of money to community groups that neighbourhood policing find that are taking young people off the street and helping them do creative and physical activities. And one of these came from the Horfield Young People's Club. They were asking for £200 to buy a table tennis table and a snooker table. And so we agreed to that and gave them £200. These tables were purchased and were heavily used. I had thank you cards from all the young people in the club. I had a 2-sided handwritten letter from the organizer of the club and an evening event with the police to thank us for this £200. All of that from a £200 ask. The second event was a visit to the Northwest Bristol Food Bank just before the lockdown started. And I asked them casually, what do you need? And they said, well, we think we need 4 things: food, money to buy petrol, more volunteers capable of lifting heavy loads, and new cardboard boxes. And it was the last one of those that really took my attention, because the first 3 are things that they do as a business. The 4th one was unusual. So I said to them, half a mile down the road, you have Accolade Wines, which is the largest wine bottling plant in Europe. Cardboard boxes is something they have in vast quantities. And I left it at that. A couple of weeks later, they came back to me and asked whether I would be able to help them. So a year before, I'd spoken at this workshop at Foundation for Leadership Through Sport at Lord's, and I know that the chief executive of Accolade Wines was in the audience. So I just emailed the co-founder of Foundation for Leadership in Sport and said, I don't suppose you could put me in contact with the managing director of Accolade Wines. He did. I mentioned the local food bank, and then shortly afterwards, 800 new cardboard boxes were delivered to the Northwest Bristol Food Bank. So there's 6 important points about this story. First of all, the asker, so the food bank, didn't know who to ask for cardboard boxes. The giver didn't know that their boxes were needed. The ask was very specific in terms of capacity, and it was the super connectivity at Bristol that was key, because I went through the co-founder of this foundation, who just happens to live in Bristol, and he connected me to Accolade Wines in Bristol. And you can see it's not all about money. And small asks can be transformational, as they were for this food bank, because now they were able to bundle up packages of food items to deliver to families. Then I remembered a remark by Chief Constable of Leicestershire and Rutland at the High Sheriff Seminar in 2019. He said, take something of your life into the lives of the people you meet. And I wrote it down at the time, not knowing what I'd do with it. And then when the food bank things happened, I suddenly thought, yes, this is actually what I can do in my year as a virtual High Sheriff. So I spent nearly 40 years in research related to large and massive scale systems. So could I apply large and massive scale systems thinking to the third sector in Bristol? And that's where Asking Bristol came from. And we have 3 ambitions. The first is to democratize asking and giving in Greater Bristol. The second is to create a hyper-connected city. And the third is to franchise it worldwide. And there's a belief that a hyper-connected city is more equal and socially cohesive. That's a belief, it's a hypothesis, it's something would be interesting to examine. And to franchise it worldwide, well, you could imagine asking Brighton or asking Barcelona or asking Boise, if the model works. And the belief here is that the model is successful with cities or regions of degrees of separation of 1 to 2. And the consequence, if we did this, it would be like our old laptops where there was an Intel Inside sticker on the keyboard. We'd have Asking Brisbane, which would say Bristol Inside. And the way we will do this is the systems part of it. We will create asks, and there are 4 types of them. And we will push them bottom up through the super connectivity of Bristol. And one very important point here is that this system is a completely bottom-up system. When people are left to their own devices, usually they do it top-down. And on the whole, top-down isn't that successful. This system is completely bottom-up. And we'll see what that means later. So, quick summary, 4 things. What's the architecture? Well, here's the architecture. Right at the bottom, we have the charities, voluntary groups, community groups, and we have the ask creation phase. This creates an ask, and that ask is then pushed up into this tree that sits above it, where the ask fulfillment happens. Asking Bristol is the creator of the asks. So in cloud computing terms, Asking Bristol is a ask service provider, or it's doing asks as a service. And these 4 types of ask then appear in a tree above, and depending on what sort of ask it is, it will be directed into the section that's most relevant to it. So things, time, expertise, and services. So asks are the currency of this economy. Asks are the currency of Asking Bristol. They need to be as specific as possible, and we'll see a nice example of this later. And not all asks are equal in scale, in impact, in simplicity, or duration. We have this role of ask authors, and these are all volunteers. And if you want to democratize asking, then what you cannot do is go to a small community group with 2 part-time volunteers and tell them they have to understand how to use systems and do all this sort of machinery. What you do is you give absolutely every participating group, from the very largest to the very smallest, an ask author who's effectively a buddy. And they talk to them about their asks and help them make them more specific. They own those asks and they submit them inside Asking Bristol up into the tree. So an ask from a very, very large charity looks no different from an ask from the very smallest. They're simple and they're precise. And the tree is key here because this is the way in which the asks are fulfilled. And there's a lot of words here. We'll actually come back to most of these in the examples later. So I'll leave that, you'll be able to read those later. So the mechanism, a group is recruited to Asking Bristol, an ask author is assigned. This is a volunteer. And our experience from the experiments we've done is that university students are extremely good at being ask authors. They then work with them to define their set of asks. And then those asks are pushed up into the tree. The connectors, who are domain experts, then route the asks through the tree to an individual, an organization, or a business that should be capable of matching that ask. And that ask terminates when that individual business or organization confirms that they are able to fulfill the ask. A direct connection is then made between the asker and the giver. So we'll have a couple of examples shortly to make this slightly less abstract. So what is the real challenge of Asking Bristol? The real challenge is scale. So Greater Bristol, which we used to call Avon until 1996, is about 1.2 million people. So the city of Bristol, the county of Bristol, is 480,000. And as High Sheriff, you're High Sheriff for the grey bit. The other bits belong to the High Sheriffs of Somerset and Gloucestershire. But anyway, since I've finished being High Sheriff, Asking Bristol now talks about Greater Bristol. The Charity Commission lists 4,310 registered charities in this area. There is an unknown number of voluntary community groups that are not charities. There might be 6,000 charities, voluntary and community groups in all. There might be 8,000, there might be 10,000, nobody knows. But where do they all come from? How could you have 10,000 such groups in an area like Greater Bristol? Well, they come from two places. They're either location-based or they're non-location-based. If you look at the city of Bristol, it's about 90 villages. And the ones we know about, like Henleys and fish ponds, to the ones that are less well known, like Inns Court and Pile Marsh. But they are all distinct individual communities inside the city. If you look at Greater Bristol, there's at least 200 of these villages. We start to add in Staple Hill and Lee Woods and Flax Bourton. Now, within the location-based communities, there are things called anchor organizations. And these act as umbrellas for smaller groups within their geography. So, for example, Ambition Lawrence Weston or BS3 Community. In addition, there are also all sorts of community groups. Then there's all the non-location-based communities that come from some specific focus or topic, such as younger people or conservation or physical activity. They have things called network organizations that, again, group some of them together. So things like Black Southwest Network and Out Bristol. But once you start looking, you discover an extraordinary number of these groups in these different subject areas. And I've only just touched the surface. When I have half an hour or so, I just go to the web and start I take a topic and search through them to find some more logos, and it is absolutely extraordinary the things that you come across. So for conservation, here's some of them, and for music, and for homelessness, and young people, and health and well-being, and green spaces. Lots of green spaces and national charities that are headquartered in Bristol. I mean, who knew that the War Poets Association was headquartered in Bristol? Who knew that Social Farms and Gardens is in Bristol? So the more you look, the more you find, and you just begin to realize that perhaps 10,000 isn't such an unlikely number. So let's go for 10,000. And imagine each of them has 20 asks a year. You're then talking about 200,000 asks per year for asking Bristol to service. So you begin to see what the scale of the problem is. You can't do this in a half-hearted fashion. You have to do it properly or not at all. So we've done 2 experiments. The first one last year started with 15 groups, and that was just in Bristol. A variety of ask authors, moderately successful. Last year, we did one with about 70 groups, including a sub-experiment with BS3. The ask authors were largely University of Bristol and UWE students. We had much more successful with some very high impact matches. So here's an example of one that worked well. Children's Scrap Store. It's a reuse charity, well established, a warehouse in St. Werburgh's. Because of lockdown, they were unable to get the materials that they'd been given out to the groups that needed them as quickly as they had pre-lockdown. So the warehouse was full, but they were still being offered really high utility, high value pallets of equipment from businesses that they knew that they could make immediate use of. So they came to us with an ask, and this is a great example of a very specific ask. They said, can you find us warehouse space in the Bristol area for up to 6 months for 15 to 30 pallets of non-hazardous materials of no commercial value, where we can access them once a week, and there is a forklift truck available with a driver to take the pallets off and on their van. So when you get an ask like that, you know exactly what you're dealing with, and then you know how to route it. And this is the way it was routed. So the ask is that little envelope at the bottom. It gets switched because it's really talking about spaces. And then it got switched to business in the community because it was commercial property. And business in the community then helped by routing it to a company that worked in logistics. And they went out on our behalf and found DHL warehouse in Severn Beach, who were absolutely delighted to be able to help us and help Children's Scrap Store with their temporary storage of their pallets. In fact, they were so delighted to help us that the regional director of DHL was the one who was engaged in the whole business. And once DHL had said, yes, we're willing to do that, then all we do is connect them directly up to Children's Scrap Store and get out of the way. So you see that asking Bristol is facilitative. Once a connection has been made, we get out of the way. And of course, it's just great stories that can be written on things like this, that then other people can look at and say, this is really interesting. I like this model. I wonder how we can get involved. This is a very quick aside. The tree is like the internet. And the ask is like an IP packet in the internet. So what we've effectively got to do is route the IP packet through the tree to the end destination, where that end destination is an individual, a business, or an organization capable of matching the ask. In the internet, all the routing, of course, is done by computers. In asking Bristol, all the routing is done by domain experts. So there's an example, a different sort of example there of an ask for pro bono legal help that then gets routed to the Bristol Pro Bono group. They then broadcast it to all the large law firms and chambers in Bristol, who then look at it and say, yeah, we'll be able to help with that. And again, the connection is made between the lawyer in the law firm or in the chambers and the group asking for that piece of help. So Bristol is a super connected city. And if you were to take a sheet of paper and to put a dot for all the individuals, all the businesses and all the organizations, and then join all of them up to the people that they knew already connected to, you end up with a highly complex and tangled picture. Hundreds of thousands of businesses and individuals and organizations, each connected to hundreds and thousands of other different individuals, businesses and organizations, giving what I believe in Bristol is largely a degree of separation of 1 to 2. And for interesting reasons, Bristol's coefficient of connectivity is unusually high. But now, when we matched DHL to Children's Scrap Store, what we effectively did was create a new connection that never existed before that goes through the middle. And once we do loads of those, and when we do hundreds of thousands of those, we now move to a picture that looks more like this. So we've moved from a 2D superconnected city to a 3D hyperconnected city. And this is much more interesting than this picture allows, because we also want to encourage askers to be givers, because many of these charities and other groups are able to do things for other charities and groups. So you start to get connections underneath the plane. And as we saw above, things like Pro Bono Bristol are aggregations of law firms, so that provides connections above the plane. So when we put them below and above and through the plane and in the plane, I believe that's the mechanism by which we reach eventually a hyperconnected city. And at that point, exploring the implications of that hyperconnectivity are truly profound. So how do we do it for real and at scale? So we saw earlier, this is what the overall system looks like. And the 4 types of asks that we have come down to believing are key are things, time, expertise, and services. You might be interested to see that money doesn't feature here. And one reason for that is that the vast majority of these groups are quite small. And what they really need are expertise or volunteers or objects or some services. And money appears in here through expertise, because what Asking Bristol would do is not say, well, here's £35,000 you've been asking for, because we have no means to give £35,000. What we say is, it is an expertise, and here are all the ways in which £35,000 might be realised. So it's an expertise more than a give in its own right. So here's an example. How do we achieve scale in things? So imagine you've got £10,000 to give out. And often people look for a charity to give for £10,000 to. But imagine you give it out as smaller lots. We saw with the Horfield Young People's Club, that was £200, which was transformational for them. Imagine it was about £500. And in all these cases, it should be for something specific rather than saying, here's some money. What you're really doing is giving the money for a specific purpose. So it might be a cycling charity for the disabled who needs £700 for an insurance policy for their equipment for the coming year, for example. So they will ask for something specific. And then you will look for this way of giving it out in these small lots. Now, many of these asks seem quite small, but they are transformational. And there are thousands of volunteers in all these groups in Bristol working their hardest to help the vulnerable and the less advantaged in the city. Often they don't know where or how to ask. And asking Bristol is truly about democracy. It's about giving them access to what they need from the very best places in the city. Charity of the Year is another example. For my previous life, it wasn't unknown for the employees to raise £20,000 and the company to do match funding up to £40,000, which would then be given to a single national charity. But that £40,000 is 80 separate gifts of £500, 80 different voluntary and community groups and charities in the city where the employees live and work could be helped through that one single pot of money. And it's in a mixed economy. You could have 30,000 given to a charity of the year and £10,000 given out through this thing I call multivarious giving, or 20 and 20. So here's an example. The Bangladeshi restaurant community in Bristol were celebrating the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh independence. And they wanted to collect £1 from each chicken tikka masala ordered in their takeaways. And they hoped to raise about £2,500. And I'd helped them previously, and they said, which charity should we give this to? And I said, well, why don't we divide it up into 5 lots of £500? So these 20 takeaways and restaurants in the Greater Bristol area, and there they all are, raised £250,000, not £2,500. So instead of a single beneficiary, we said, let's give it to 5 independents. And we said, well, let's choose a theme. And the theme we chose was equipment for voluntary groups offering physical activity for young people. What Asking Bristol did was then go out among some of the less, the communities in the greater need, and worked with these 5. So Street Space was a brilliant charity in Philwood Park and Knowle. The Barton Hill Amateur Boxing Club, St Oldham's girls football team in Withywood, the Oasis Hub in North Bristol, so in Lawrence Weston, and Confidence, which started off in Shirehampton, works in Lockleys as well. And they collected that money. And we have delivered those £500, or be in the process of delivering £500 for very specific purposes. So, for example, the Barton Hill Boxing Club wanted to buy 100 skipping ropes at £5, so that the new recruits to the boxing club had something so they could carry on training while they were away from the club. And I think the success of this approach demonstrates that this model will work for large enterprises and SMEs who are doing charity every year, but it will also work for trusts and foundations or consortiums like the Bristol Bangladeshi group, or even family funds and individuals. But now you begin to see how scale works, because if all these different organizations fully engaged in it, there are tens of thousands of gifts that could be made a year just in the Greater Bristol area. So to finish, we believe that Asking Bristol would work at scale, and it would create a hyper-connected Bristol, and that the model is replicable. The question is how to achieve this scaling up in a sustainable fashion. And there I finish.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. That was wonderful. It reminds me of why I got involved in this in the first place, because it's such a bloody good project. What I wanted to do now was just raise a couple of questions, just to kind of seed the audience really with some ideas. One is the one that John began with, really, which is this sort of idea that to a certain extent, Asking Bristol is a bit of a challenge to some established providers, whether we're talking about big charities or various kind of city, town councils and so on, regional authorities that may consider this to be part of their bailiwick and not really a set of questions that can be addressed by grassroots organisation. Secondly, as I and John have talked about a lot, networks in a city, social networks in the city, are unevenly distributed. So we shouldn't imagine that everybody in Bristol has equal access to the same sort of networks. There are networks around the university, around the city council, around the watershed, and so on. So networks tend to be homophilic. They tend to have similar kinds of people within them. And particularly in the case of Bristol, apologies for those people who don't come from Bristol, but it's basically got a more affluent and whiter north and west, and a much more diverse and poor south and east. And my guess is if you did sort of try to model the networks, then they would tend to be networks that were that rarely crossed the divide between the two parts of the city. Yeah. Thirdly, there is an issue here about the centrality of John to this process so far, because he himself is a remarkably hyper-connected individual, and it's part of his understanding of the city and connections within it that have made the project work so far. So in a sense, its sustainability going forward does require that, and don't take this the wrong way, John, that John kind of moved out of the way in order that the Asking Bristol system could work without his prodigious connections and knowledge. And the last point I'd like to make is something about the, for me, really interesting issue about students and universities in this process. So the city of Bristol, again, for those people who don't know, it's an urban population, the city's population about 500,000, about 1 million in the metro area, but two pretty big universities by UK sizes. They're both in excess of 30,000 students, so an awful lot of students in the city. Both universities have public relations problems, I think it's fair to say, because they're increasingly shaping the city, and many ordinary Bristolians don't necessarily see them as being benign influences on rent and development and a whole series of other things. And many of the students who are coming to the city also lack a sense of being connected to the place and finding ways of basically paying out their politics and their interests in terms of connecting them to particular sorts of groups and so on. But this seems like a fantastic way for universities to do something useful, to actually be central to constructing the hyper-connected city and using the talents and enthusiasm of many of our students in order to do so. So with that, I'll stop. But I can see, are you all right with me just chairing this then, John? Yeah. Sorry, Ian, I mean? Yeah, okay. So I've got a question from John Waters first, hand up.
Yeah, well, actually I have several questions, but I'm not going to try to get them out. I think it's absolutely right to start from the bottom up, but I always worry about anything which is centralized in this way. The people have many reasons to treat such things with suspicion, I think, and it won't capture everything it can. There are ways around this, and I'd be very happy to discuss these with you at length, but not here. My most immediate question comes around to what extent something such as expertise, which would normally be considered taxable activity, can pass unnoticed by the tax authorities. Again, there are ways around this. It's possible to use a charitable body to create what's called a covestment loop to build a localizing effect on a truly a local money. But sooner or later, if you're doing something which would normally contribute to the tax system, it will get noticed, questions will be asked. And this is why generally time-based, time-accounted activity, time banks, time networks is generally exempt from affecting benefits or being taxed because it's not used for activity which could normally be exploited by a third person to make profit. Whereas something which is actually accounting using something either legal tender or metrically equivalent to it has to ensure that the accounts are kept in case the tax people come knocking at your door. Is this something that fits into your model?
I think that if you look at the vast majority of the requests for expertise, they are really very small. And since they're all going into the charity sector, there isn't any notion that an economic transaction has happened. So, for example, the Ambition Lawrence Weston wanted some expertise in planting for the community spaces in Lawrence Weston. It's an area where the community spirit is very high, but some of the infrastructure isn't. And so they've just wanted some expertise. That one, we coupled them with the University Botanic Gardens. And so the curator of the University Botanic Gardens went down to Lawrence Weston and gave them expertise in how to plant shrubs and plants, things that might be edible, things that might be sensory, things that might be medicinal. And at the end of it, that was the end of that transaction. And I don't think it's the sort of thing that the tax man would be interested in. And expertise is fascinating because expertise is absolutely everything. It might be horticultural, but it might be translation. It might be mentoring. It might be giving a talk to somebody. It might be doing some training. And if you look through the types of requests for expertise that we had, I think you'll find that they are, in general, very specific. They're very time limited and very various in their nature.
Can I just be cheeky and ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Can I just respond to the way you started as well, John? Because I do recognise one of my other questions that I didn't pose was the kind of about the ownership and control of Asking Bristol. That was kind of where you started, and I think that's really quite crucial. That if this and I and John have talked about this quite a lot, if this project is to have a kind of legitimacy and not be seen to be kind of a sort of a technocratic bunch of people who are performing Lady Bountiful services for those who don't have, then it needs to have a structure, forms of representation and governance that are as diverse as the city that we live in. And I think I absolutely take that point. I think it's really important. But you had another point, John.
Well, just partly a follow-up. I think it's utterly laudable, and I think it's absolutely brilliant that you're setting up on this kind of scale. But I also think maybe you're setting your sights too low. I think you could climb much higher, much faster, by filling in some of the gaps, and including providing ways for people to create their own pockets in which they feel they're not so under scrutiny. Where they might stick their toe where they wouldn't otherwise. It's difficult to explain, but I think that there's a foundation here for something much bigger. And I'd like to talk to you both at some time, but not here.
Yeah, but no, we'd very much appreciate that, John.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
We'll get the conversation that up shortly afterwards. Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat from Jim, who's asking, what can you explain what you mean by degrees of separation? For example, 1 to 2 and 0 to 1.
All it means is how many individuals do you have to go through in order to reach another individual?
Yeah, Jim, do you want to just unmute?
Okay, I thought, I just wanted to check that that's what I thought you meant. And I think like John Waters, I'm super interested in this. And it's very close to some work I've been doing on sort of modeling of communities. There's three things I've got to say about this. I mean, first of all, people can be members of many communities, and it's a great source of inequality because other people can't be. I think I'm probably a member in Bristol of about 12 formal communities and about a further 10 to 12 informal communities. And there's lots of people, that's the source of my richness and why it's great to live in a city. And other people in Bristol don't have access to any communities. Mm-hmm. So it's about how you make it more inclusive, a really big challenge. And I think that might be connected to the second point I'd make, which is what you're describing really, I think, is something that you've envisaged it within the gift economy, right? Giving and receiving, when actually it needs to be in what we might call mutual aid, or what I would call the love economy. where we give with, you know, where there's much more love and mutuality rather than giving and receiving tends to be a little bit sort of there's givers and receivers. And I think this model a bit, which comes to the third point, which I think was the point that Martin was making about, is all around you. And, you know, one of the key things that we have to tackle in the modeling is how we deal with the question of reputation. Yeah. Because there's a reputational bias here, you know, so, you know, it's great for the beneficiaries to have no reputation, and it's all at the behest of those with a reputation. Yeah. So, and that comes back to the social branding of this, is about how do we democratize the brand? How do we make it accessible to all? And maybe how do we shift it to more of a sort of mutual aid economy rather than a gift economy? So it's sort of connected for me.
Well, one of the evolutions is, and you saw us in that little architecture picture. To begin with, we thought of asking Bristol as everything. And now we say, no, asking Bristol has a very, very specific role in a much larger architecture. And that is merely the creation of the asks. And then the mechanisms for fulfilling the asks are left to a variety of other structures and organizations. And so no longer is there an individual in the middle who seems to be in control of everything. Actually, all of that control has been given away to others. And the challenge is to set up the structures that allow us to create those other things that deal with the fulfillment of the tree in the tree.
Just to sort of quickly say something about that as well, and responding to that comment from David Richmond in the chat, can givers also be askers?
Yeah.
Because where the tree metaphor, I think, and John disagrees with me a bit on this, I think the tree metaphor starts to break down, is that it's sort of, you know, it's top down, isn't it? It's to, and one of the really interesting things that we were talking about was particularly for the community anchor organizations, that they could be both givers and receivers, that the whole network then starts to become much more entangled, more complicated, and look more like a mutual aid network, Jim, I think, rather than simply imagining it as, again, back to that sort of metaphor of Lady Bountiful at the top and the deserving poor at the bottom. And that's something we really must avoid, I think, isn't it? Is that sort of image of basically the wealthy and whiter north and west giving to the poorer and more diverse south and east of the city. Yeah.
Which is exactly why the headline for this says to democratize asking and giving.
Yeah.
It's not enough to democratize asking, you have to democratize giving as well. And you democratize giving by allowing giving everybody the opportunity to step in and to help fulfill an ask. So, and many organizations and individuals will be dual-hatted. They might be asking for something, and they might be giving something at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a question from Robert, and then Catherine after that. So, Robert.
Thank you. Just going to preface this real quick by my kind of apology that I don't already know a little bit more about asking Bristol, but I did really like this presentation, and I was curious about the goal you set in ending the presentation about wanting to sort of sustain what you've already accomplished, and really especially to grow it and to make it sustainable in that sense. And I'm wondering kind of what is the kind of gauge for success there in sustainability, and how that's kind of defined, and then also how it's kind of being measured. And my guess is, based on kind of what you've been saying so far, are that you would say, well, it's more successful because we've seen a growth in participants, whether that's merely a quantitative increase or probably better, like a decrease in degrees of separation. So you see this kind of quantitative sense in which you are kind of growing. But beyond the kind of question of growth, I'm not really sure if you have other targets for kind of determining whether or not you are becoming and keeping with the sustainability that you're achieving. So I'm just kind of wondering how you're measuring that and thinking about determining those sustainability targets.
So I think that there's two separate things there. One is, can asking Bristol itself be sustainable? And the second question is, if it is seen to be a successful model, how could it be spread beyond the boundaries of Bristol? And I'm quite interested in all the different ways in which charities can grow in size. And I particularly like the social franchising model, where you make something successful and then you write a book effectively and say, this is what you have to do if you want to do what we've done to be successful. And then you just give it to other people. You don't regard it as a commercial transaction. You just give it to another city like Brighton that says, actually, we'd like to try this. And what you do is you help them set it up there. And it's particularly obvious in this case, unlike some other charities, that it is not something that you do by expanding. You do not, asking Bristol suddenly doesn't include Brighton, because the whole thing is based upon local knowledge and connectivity. And we know nothing about Brighton. So therefore, what you do is you tell them, this is how you do it. And then they can, because Brighton is different from Bristol, they will have their own regional twists on it, but they will take the basic model and then have a go at doing it themselves. And there's no reason why you shouldn't do that in any other city where you think that the connectivity is great enough to be allowed you to do it.
More generally, Robert, I mean, I think you're raising some really interesting questions about what you might measure, what sort of outcome-based measures there might be. I'm always a bit suspicious of going too quickly, because obviously very often then activity is driven by the need to produce the metrics that you've promised, that kind of thing. But I'd be really interested in conversations about what appropriate helpful metrics might look like.
Right. Just to extend this briefly, Martin, I think thank you, John, but Martin, you're definitely hearing what I'm saying very well there, because I'm actually thinking of this as something like, would you want to be able to, or maybe you already are, and I apologize that I don't know that, but would you want to be able to like produce reports, right, where you're showing you have specific measurements that you actually are kind of meeting or growing these sustainability targets, whether for your, others, or for your own self, even like, a kind of determinate measure of success. That's all. And thank you.
So I very much understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I am a great believer in qualitative data rather than quantitative data. Because an ask that takes 30 seconds to get fulfilled is very different from one where it takes weeks and weeks of work to get it fulfilled. And to count them as both successful asks, you're not measuring the same things. But if you then put in a more exotic measurement system, all you do eventually is distort people's behavior because they're being driven by the metric system. So I believe that the right way of doing this is through stories. So the story of Children's Scrap Store and DHL is far more powerful than saying there was a successful match in a request for some space. And the success of Asking Bristol should be in the stories it can tell, rather than some arbitrary and distorting mechanisms through measuring things.
If you have a look at the website, it's full of stories.
Yeah, but not as full as it should be, because
not as full as it should be, but yeah, but there's lots of good stories.
All sorts of problems with the website.
Yeah, sorry, Catherine's been waiting ages. Catherine, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Oh, well, it's really interesting, and I don't know if the rest of you all know each other. I'm afraid I only know Ian.
Nice to meet you.
Just to put my questions in context, hopefully, I'm an ecologist. I was an overseas development sustainability person, and then I came back and worked as a science advisor and evidence lead for government agencies. So evidence-based decision making is the sort of which obviously includes systems thinking and interdisciplinarity for integrated responses. So that's why I'm here and listening, and I really enjoyed listening to a completely different context of these principles. My first slightly light one is don't dismiss the tree metaphor, because trees don't only take things from the top. be absorbed from the bottom.
Yeah, that's
So-
true. Yeah, accepted.
So
Yes.
it's actually a really good metaphor if you use it more extensively. The other is that as I was listening, and obviously I'm not understanding a lot of this because I haven't looked at this until now. I haven't read very much. Is I've been involved in an enormous number of attempts to bring people together. And both in very specifics, government policy people asking perhaps not very well-formed questions, and scientists and other researchers not quite knowing how to answer them. And it's in effect the same, if I can say, there are a lot of general issues there. But there are there have been a number of attempts, and you probably know them as well, of bringing these people together in different ways. And it may be useful to see how they've failed, learning how these other, integrating these information systems have failed. And things like, I don't suppose they'd be happy for me to say they failed, but the National Centre for Universities and Businesses, we've got millions, we've got masses of universities, masses of experts, we've got masses of businesses. How do you bring them together? And they've done it simply, as it were, on software, and it's not very effective. Whereas something like, some of you may know, CCAMS is a very specific system bringing businesses or marine focus with researchers of marine focus, be science and researchers, and the ways in which they have tried to bring people together and articulate the right question for the, so that the businesses know they ask their question. It doesn't always, it's not always the right question, and then getting the most appropriate people to help them. I don't know whether it would be helpful to look at those sort of more technical systems, but it's very similar, therefore, to what I've been doing in growing a large group of integrated evidence people across all disciplines to articulate with the policy people and government their questions and bringing most appropriate evidence and answers together. You may feel it doesn't have anything to do with what you're doing, but my final question, therefore, is what I really missed in the presentation was that bit in the middle, because you've got the people that are asking, and if it's something like they want 80 boxes and you find people that have got 80 boxes, that's fine. But in terms of expertise and skills, who is it that's mapping them? Those people that are mapping them have a huge responsibility, unless you're going to do this in a fairly automatic way. And how much discussion is there with the charities that are asking for the help about their ask? Is it always so tangible that it's easy peasy and anybody can map them across, or do you bring expertise in articulating questions so you can find the right people to help them? Sorry.
Oh, no, thank you for that. So as I said, Asking Bristol is facilitative. So what it does is rely upon things that other people do. So in Bristol, for example, it's really unusual, but the legal sector, which is a very, very large legal sector, have already organized themselves to do all of this. So there are 3 organizations that were created by the Bristol Law Society, which is the oldest law society in the country, one called Bristol Pro Bono. So if you have a pro bono legal ask, you just direct it to them and they take care of the communication with all the lawyers. There's another group, the Bristol Legal Trustees Group. So if you need a trustee with legal experience, you just send it to them and they will deal with it. And then there's another one in the middle that takes care of everything else that the law firms could do. And that goes to the law firms, the chambers, the judiciary, the law centre and up. So what we've done, for example, is just talked to the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales and say, look what the lawyers have done. Wouldn't it be nice if the chartered accountants could do similar in the Bristol area? And then you can go and talk to the HR organizations and the IT organizations and the marketing and the states and so on. And of course, some of those are already set up. Some of those are set up through voluntary organizations like Tech Volunteers or the Digital Southwest. So a number of these things already exist. What we'd hope to do, and particularly through telling stories, is to encourage other organizations to look at it and say, actually, we could do exactly the same. And at that point, the tree, which I said is like the internet, starts to get a whole lot of intranets. In an intranet, you never understand the structure of an intranet. You just talk to the root node. And it's exactly the same with Bristol Pro Bono. You just talk to the root node and they deal with the whole legal sector for you. And so it's not things that we set up, it's not things that we have to do. It's things which in time, all these different groups of expertise around the city and around the country organize themselves to help you do it.
Okay, yeah, so I might have been thinking that some of the questions and the help was perhaps more unformed. I mean, I fully understand if, you know, that you're when you're referring to your legal section or something that's quite clear, there's quite a clear ask. I think my life is dealing with the more complicated, you know, unformed asks, and maybe that's a step too far. But when I see this mass of charities, and particularly a mass of smaller charities, all trying to do quite often in cases similar things, I sort of almost expected you to be looking at a more facilitative way of helping them to ask more perhaps more complicated questions or more transformative questions, as opposed to the boxes or the whatever else it would be. Yeah, see how it might evolve.
Yeah. But some of these asks are for transformative things, in which case they're asking for people to do mentoring, for example. And we've got nice examples of groups who are starting up, who are asking for some mentoring, and we set up some quite long-term relationships with extremely talented people who have enough time to be able to give that mentoring a proper job.
I guess it would have been really nice to have some of the students here, because in a sense what their accounts were about the kind of the granularity, the specificity of some of these asks. And as John says, they can be quite transformative. I was ask author on for a couple of organizations, and they were really interesting conversations, particularly if you said, well, what exactly do you want and how long do you want it for? Yeah, so, you know, stuff about, there was one, we were talking about a garden and what they might need for the garden. So do you need some plants? Do you need some labor? You know, they don't really need labor. They've got people to do that kind of stuff, but they do need some plants, and they probably need a bit of expertise to know which plants are going to survive because this is just next to a busy road. And will they need some containers? Yeah, they'll probably need some containers as well. So you kind of, you know, you could focus on some quite specific things that would make a difference to that particular group in that particular neighborhood. They're not transformative, I suspect, in the systemic sense that you're talking about. Yeah, although the whole project is certainly intended to be.
Some of the transformative ones have gone to an organization called 180 Degrees Bristol.
Yeah,
which is a student consulting organization. It's part of a worldwide organization where the students are truly extraordinary in what they do and their skills. And they will engage in 8-week projects with 6 consultants. And at the end of that project, they will have a follow-on project if it's thought necessary. And so some of the bigger things we've done have been through this student consulting organization, but it is all entirely pro bono.
Yeah, and they've been bloody amazing, really. Yeah. I've got Katie next. Can't hear you, Katie.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. No, thank you. It's a very inspiring initiative. I think it sounds great. As a sort of coming from a devil's advocate perspective, though, and just thinking about there's a critique of sort of the move towards professionalizing everything. And I was just wondering, how do you kind of ensure that you're not kind of taking kind of capacity away from these community groups, and how? So I think perhaps it relates to that previous question around, which led to the comments around mentoring. So how do you ensure that when kind of where it's appropriate, you're doing more of that kind of capacity building and not just shooting in the expert who does the work and then leaves, but actually kind of really building the groups and helping them in that way? So that was kind of, yeah, one thought. So yeah, be interested to hear.
And of course that all depends upon relationships, I think. So there was one really nice example of a group that was newly formed. This person doing it had wonderful ambitions for how he was going to help some of those less able to express themselves through video and through blogs and things, create a platform in which they could do this and give them all the support and have a space where he had all the equipment. They go in and he would work with some of those who were least able and to do that. And he needed some mentoring as to how to think about this as a business and how to think about approaching people to get funding and so on. And we found someone who has turned out to be absolutely ideal, and he's been working with him for over a year now, and this group has just thrived and flourished as a result of it. So it is all about relationships.
I suppose it's a bit like dating or something, isn't it? You know, you can guarantee the relationship's going to work.
Yeah.
But there's no way we can mandate a successful relationship.
Right.
I've got Diana was invited in to talk about local money and lets and stuff. So I've got Diana next, and then Ian.
So I wasn't really going to try and relate it to anything that I'm doing currently, but I think there are lots of crossovers. I have had a separate conversation with John where we've kind of thought about this a bit, and I think especially thinking about that question about counting and reporting on this. I love the idea of a non-fungible token, which is a very unique thing. Each interaction could have a token. It could have attributes that help you tell that story and help you turn that into graphics. And that's precisely what we're trying to do with the Bristol Pay idea. So I think that there's lots of crossover, but that wasn't really what I was going to say. I was going to think about this more. You were saying you want to make this viable, and I guess my question is, isn't that difficult? Right, sorry. That's it, gone now. So I was thinking about the costs, and clearly there's a marketing cost here. But even if you get volunteers doing all the asks and you manage to get some kind of basic little platform set up that enables this to be coordinated in some way, there's certainly, if there are 10,000 little organizations, which I can believe, it's very difficult to lots of people have tried to make things happen for those little tiny organizations, and the fact is it's very difficult to even keep any kind of diary up to date or directory up to date, or send information out to people, or so I'm wondering how you think about that. A second question is, you were saying, it's not just about things, it's about an approach to giving money as well, and I think that's a very different thing. And it's very hard to see without excellent marketing, where that absolutely everybody knows about everything. It's very hard to see how those little pots of money are definitely going to end up in the right places in a democratic way. And we're back to the problem that charities have. And I know this because those of you that don't know me, my background was charity CEO for many years, and working at other senior levels in charities, in both social care type settings and also in environmental settings. So I know a bit, about how difficult it is to yeah, the time wasting for saying, I want this grant, we need it. And then you have to jump through all kinds of hoops and hurdles, spend a lot of time trying to ask for this bit of money. And then they say, oh, so we didn't really have enough and you haven't got it. And I think this other problem, I guess the final point is, a general critique of the fact that this is how we organize our society. On the other hand, though, what I do like about this approach is that it's trying to take, especially if we ignore the money bit, trying to take it outside the market economy. That's exactly what we need to do at the moment. We've marketized everything, and we've even turned the voluntary sector into a market, which is really worrying. And so the idea of trying to turn this into something which, I loved what who was it that said, the love economy, and this shouldn't be seen as givers and receivers. We need democratic. For me, it means equality of respect and power within the system, and to kind of that's what's wrong with the voluntary sector, is all that. Anyway, I'll shut up now. It's probably enough.
What's intended here is not that a charity, whatever size they are, say, these are all the things that we need in order to survive, which includes pots of money. Please go and find them for us. All charities, and particularly ones with permanent staff, they do most of this stuff themselves, and that's that's absolutely right. We're not usurping any of that. We wouldn't even want to. For the larger ones, it would be, are there things which they need, which are out of the ordinary, which some other people with greater connectivity might be able to direct them towards? And that's often to do with expertise. So in none of these cases are we giving anybody any money, because we don't have any money. All the things that are being asked for are things, they're services, which might be space or whatever. It might be time through volunteering, or it might be expertise. The example of things, though, is an interesting one, because you could give them the thing, but our experience is that there is this way of giving them a thing where somebody says, we want to give you the thing, but we're going to give you the money to buy the thing. We're not giving you money just for normal use. We're giving you money for this very specific purpose instead of giving you the thing. And that's the only time really that money appears in this, other than in the expertise one. If somebody says we need £50,000, what are the way of doing it? Then all you do is have some expertise and say, well, if you want £50,000, you could borrow it, you could do income generation, you could go to loan. These are the ways in which you do it. But it's nothing more than signposting. It's not raising that £50,000 for them, it's signposting. So money doesn't really play a part in this model.
Sorry, can you just explain, because you did have several slides showing how, it should be small grants, not big grants, and thinking about businesses giving small grants. So yeah, you're saying that is that part of the Ask Bristol thing?
Oh yeah, but that's to buy very specific things. It's not just money. So the Barton Hill Boxing Club says we want 100 skipping ropes. And you say, oh, we'll help you get 100 skipping ropes. And they say, well, it costs £500. Well, here's £500 for buying those skipping ropes.
And so, yeah, I still don't really understand how you do that without some kind of grant administration process, and then you have to get loads of people to give. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
So as I said, Asking Bristol is purely facilitative, and it sits at the bottom of the tree. All these other things are done by other people, and there are ways in which, so we've been talking to this charity called Wishy that does virtual wishing trees, and so that thing could be administered through Wishy. All we would do is give an ask to Wishy, and they would have it on the virtual wishing tree, and then people who wanted to give out small amounts of money for specific objects would look through here and say, look, there's £500 here for skipping ropes, we want to do that, tick, and that's done. But we don't do any of that. We have to work through other people.
Okay, so Ian is next up.
Thank you, John. It's fascinating stuff. I've got three points. A little bit theoretical. So I'll start with The one, first one, which is you use the analogy of a packet switching network for the asks, and I wondered whether you needed a sort of a hybrid which also had an Ethernet protocol in it, which what the asks were across all the potential givers, so that they can sort of listen in and get an appreciation of what's going on in total, but also you get through to those people that you weren't able to find through the process you're talking about, which is sort of bringing it into a center and then trying to find the route out to the giver. So I wonder whether you were thinking about that sort of casting function the system might have.
So as far as possible, to begin with, I would like this to be completely bottom up. And at the moment you get people able to observe and pick off things themselves, then you start to get a top-down element. So let's, just to begin with, see whether the totally bottom-up system works.
Right, okay, yeah.
Which means that people, it's often assumed that Asking Bristol creates a platform that anybody can go to and find an ask and do something with. There is no platform. There is no publicly accessible platform for the asks.
Right, okay, that's an interesting.
And as a systems person, that pleases me that we don't have a system.
Right. I like it. The second point there is about that process then. It comes to my mind that there could be a role for a systems approach looking at the asks and seeing whether they are the right ask in a sense, or whether there's something else that could be added to the ask or thought about in a more systemic way than just saying, here's an ask, we're trying to find.
Yeah. So this goes back to the specificity of an ask.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something we'll learn over time. So this is something that ask authors then can increasingly be trained in, as to how to recognize a specific ask, or how to recognize when an ask isn't specific enough, mm-hmm. and to talk a little bit more to the group to make it more specific.
Right. Okay, good.
And you do find all sorts of interesting things, and it's all a matter of experience. So there was one group that wanted a Christmas tree because it was the center of their community, and the one they'd had for many years had just died. Mm-hmm. And so we did quite a lot of work, including talking to the British Christmas Tree Growers Association and all sorts of things I never knew existed. What we only discovered halfway through was that this community actually had a sizable amount of money set aside to buy this Christmas tree.
Ah.
And we hadn't even thought about it. This is in the really early days. We hadn't even thought about asking that during the process. And once we did, then the whole landscape changed. So it's just a matter of experience. We need to gain some experience on how to do this.
Right. So there's a lot of experience building within that central process of looking at asks and
which then gets reflected into the training of these ask authors.
Yeah. So there's a lot of need for that continuity and that sort of general inherent knowledge about to be built up. Fine. Another little question came to my mind is, are some of the asks looking for long-term relationships between askers and givers? Because when I've been involved with groups in Bristol, it's often been that need for establishing something that's going to have quite a long term of small amounts of giving into an organization, because often if it gets something once, it raises expectations, and when it doesn't come again, these people can be a bit disappointed.
Yeah, but see, that often happens with money. Because if you give them £500 in year one, they think, oh, I'm going to get £500 in year two. But if you're talking about £500 for some specific purpose, then that might well not arise in future years. So again, this is the problem of money. But there are long-term relationships. And some of these long-term relationships are quite demanding. So for example, finding trustees for charities who can act as treasurer is really one of the most difficult ones at the moment, because a treasurer has to give quite a lot of time and commitment. And we get requests where they are asking for up to a day a week of the person's time, so they become fully aware of what the charity does and what its needs are. And of course, to be a treasurer, you'd expect that to be a 3 to 5 year term. But these things are possible because, for example, with retiring or retired accountants, this is often something which they're looking for. But again, you go to the Institute of the Chartered Accountants of England and Wales and have that discussion with them about, is there a mechanism by which retiring or retired accountants can express an interest in becoming a treasurer of a trustee?
Right, okay. So again, I suppose it's trying to formulate what that ask is. It's appropriate for both sides, for both parties. Yeah. Thanks.
And another analogy with the internet is this is best effort.
Right.
It doesn't mean that every ask can be done.
No. Oh, exactly. Yeah.
And that does raise, Ian, that sort of problem of unfulfilled asks. Because clearly, if this thing's going to work, it needs to get a reputation of being useful for the people who are investing some time and effort into formulating their asks.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't fulfill them, then that's going, that story will spread fairly rapidly as well, won't it?
No, but I think you just need to set expectations when you start.
Okay.
Yeah, because if you ask for something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's possible.
Santa might not be able to do it this time.
Yeah.
Yes, we've all been there on that one. Yeah. My last little point is about scaling out, as you might say, to other communities, other cities, etc. And just again, a theoretical. I'm just coming to the end of this book by Geoffrey West called Scale, and I think it could be very appropriate to what you're talking about. So I would highly recommend that. But in it sort of shows how the larger the city, the more connections there are, and the more opportunities there are for higher things that just couldn't happen at smaller cities. I just wondered whether, if you start looking at how that scales out, whether there's an appropriate size for where this might work. And some cities and communities might be just too small. But I also have maybe an intuition that maybe some cities are too big.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't do Greater London, for example.
No,
Yes.
But
there are other cities you can think of close to London, which are more like dormitory cities. And so you really do wonder whether they have any connectivity because they function as dormitory cities rather than communities in their own right.
Yeah. It'd be fascinating to see this develop and how the structure might work. Anyway, thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Ian. So we've got 3 more questions, and then I think we should probably draw it to a close because we've been going for an hour and a half. So I think it was this order: Robert, John, and then Catherine, I think, unless anyone has disagreements. So Robert first.
I think this question is pretty brief. Just because I am really new to things, I am just now wondering about what the physical, or maybe a better term is like infrastructural embodiment of Asking Bristol is. Is there a building? Is it a website? How do you interface with the networks such that, like, if I have to ask, or my organization to represent hasn't asked, where's the embodiment, even if it's just virtual?
Yeah, it's a website at the moment.
Yeah, I was looking at it, and thanks for sending that, Martin. Okay, that's probably all.
Yeah. It would be nice to say that we had a gigantic office block in the city centre.
The IT embodiment of it would only be an administrative platform for asks.
Thank you.
Which is what we had in the second experiment, based on Airtable.
Airtable, God. It was a clunky piece of software.
No, I thought it was great.
No, you did.
Yes, I did. Airtable is a 21st century amalgam of databases and spreadsheets and.
All right. I liked your original version of it as the pile. It was just going to be a pile of data that people kind of tunnel around and find interesting things.
A heap.
A heap. Sorry.
Yeah. It's internet thinking. Things are not based upon tables and search and query. They're based upon heaps and search.
Just heaps. Yeah. So the answer, Robert, is there isn't, but there might be in future.
Well,
I guess.
So if I'm in an organization who wants to make and ask or give, I have to find the website. Is that right? Is there an extension out?
What happens is you say you'd like to be part of Asking Bristol, and then you get an Ask Author who deals with it all for you. Because most people do not want to be involved with any systems. The Ask Author does it all for you. And that's the way you democratize it, because if you are two part-time volunteers running something, you're up to your eyeballs in running what you're doing. You don't want to have any new artificial complexity added to your life.
A nice comment from David there about the language of ask and give. That's really interesting. We could talk about that a lot more. I do like the idea of the gift economy and so on. But yeah, I can accept the way in which that embeds certain sorts of inequalities and obligations. We've got John and then Catherine. And then I might as well let Robert in since he's put his hands up, but nobody after that. John.
Okay, I'll try to keep this down to one question. It's basically around the term democratic. I mean, to what extent is to what extent do you have democracy within it? To what extent can that democracy be trusted to ensure that resources are matched to needs in an optimal way, which will achieve the greatest results? And since you can't satisfy everyone, do you have the means to create the appropriate feedback loops and reassurance to individuals who might feel disappointed upon the first or second round? Are there mechanisms to actually measure outcomes in a way which are accessible to people who might feel disillusioned? In fact, this is basically all about feedback loops. I just want to sneak one more comment in here. I wouldn't be inclined to dismiss the idea of going to something the size of Greater London or even a country or even a whole world. This is a variety management problem, and I think it can be dealt with effectively by nested recursion, making sure that the variety is constrained in such a way that it's manageable, but building in the feedback loops so that everyone has some kind of accessible guidance about the effects of their actions. Again, we can talk about this. I'll bore you at length about it when we can talk.
Those are all great points. And what I think is that what I've been describing here are some ideas. Some ideas have led to some principles and to an approach to doing something. That is not to say that everything is worked out. It's very far from worked out. And if we were to do this for scale, and we might not do it at scale because we can't see a way of doing it at scale, but if we were to do it at scale, then we would begin to understand some of these questions you're asking. And I think the most important thing is to factor in the need to know answers to questions like that as we evolve. But at the moment, I can't tell you the answers. All I can say is that if you look at the sorts of asks you get, they are so widespread, so different, that the idea that everybody is competing for one or two little things is not right. They are completely all over the map.
Thanks for that lovely comment from Robert there. That's really kind. I just want to say, to repeat to John, that I think the questions about ownership and control of whatever sort of institution Asking Bristol becomes are really crucial. And you can certainly articulate that in terms of recursion and feedback and so on. But I think there's also questions of just sort of legitimacy in a way. You would need to think very carefully about how this was held. I mean, we talked about community interest company or something along those lines, because it's really important. It's not seen to be a property of one of the city council or one of the universities or something along those lines. It needs to be something that, as far as is possible, is imagined to be a property of the city. Yeah, and I don't know how we achieve that, but I recognise the importance of it.
Can I just say two quick things on that? So my view of ideal systems are ones that are bottom up, where the intelligence is at the periphery and where they're decentralized. And if we were to do and Asking Bristol tries as hard to stick to those principles. So it isn't a central control thing. It isn't all the intelligence at the middle. It has to be intelligence at the edge, decentralized and bottom up.
So last question, comment from Catherine.
Thank you. Yeah, so it was really interesting. John just said what he said, because my question was coming back to what I had asked before, and that is the vulnerability of that central sifting, these ask authors, you know, and what training they've got, what questions they're asking, and how vulnerable the whole system is with their expertise. And it's fine. I very quickly looked up this 180. Bristol looks admirable, and I can fully understand some marvelous work done by those people. But that, to me, is where I would be really interested. You know, what are the questions they're asking? How many of these people, how are you training them? Because you've emphasized again and again the incredible extensive diversity of these charities and the activities and of the people that can help them. And at the moment, I'm going away with a bit of a sort of question of that middle issue, particularly if you want to scale it up. So maybe I can find out a bit more about that from you and from the platform.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
And I just want to repeat something I said earlier on, which is so let's say 3-6 months ago, we were thinking of Asking Bristol as being the totality of this. This is now restructured in that architecture diagram I have with the 4 colors in the tree, where Asking Bristol is only what it was originally, which was the generator of the asks. And all this other stuff belongs to other organizations and other systems. And so this, and so it is a shared responsibility of many different organizations in an area to work together to make it work, where there is a unique role played by Asking Bristol, which is purely the generation of the asks.
Yeah, but is it David? Yeah, the broker. It's those knowledge brokers in the middle. And I will go back to all these networks that bring people together that are asking for things and are providing things, be they the universities and businesses and the other things I mentioned. That is absolutely crucial. Anyway, I'd be really interested to see how you're managing that and how you're approaching it. Maybe we can have a conversation.
Yeah. I mean, one of the issues is that, I mean, say talking about, say, training or something along those lines, you know, we don't have any budgets or anything. So at the moment, all of this is basically pro bono, voluntary. I mean, I can do it because by the university and so on, but you know, John's doing all this for free and the students were doing it for free and so on. So thinking about how we build a robust organization, robust yet flexible organization, does require thinking about resourcing, you know, with them. Not much. I mean, we don't need that much, but we're clearly going to need something in order to get people to do bits and pieces.
Yeah, and some of the things I was referring to, you know, there are things that you could potentially draw on from other fields, particularly the evidence field. So, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, everybody, and fantastically interesting comments in the chat as well. Shall I just pass back to Ian to close us off, because he's the boss?
Thanks.
Yeah. It's a hierarchical organisation.
No, we're very flat, very decent. I'm glad to say. John, Martin, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. And I really look forward to seeing how this works out, and I hope we can contribute, give into the system, and maybe start thinking some asks as well. So there's a great richness here, I feel, and I think it's something that if Bristol could make it happen, it can happen everywhere in the world, and it really deserves to be. So
one last thing to say is there is a 300-slide presentation that gives a lot more detail.
Don't just ignore that last remark.
No, because I prefer that to writing. And there is also a much smaller one, and there's historic one of the overview. So those three things together might well answer some of the questions. So if anybody wants to have a copy of them, everyone, I put my email address and you'll have that, but I'll put it down here.
Right.
Yeah, but thoughts, do email me at the university as well, martin.parker@bristol. And, you know, I'd love to hear from anybody who's got more thoughts about what we can do with this stuff.
So there's my email address. If you want to have the slides, I'm very happy to send these.
Thank you, John. I will. Thank you. Please send them through. That'd be great. And you know, it's an interesting ask to look through 300 slides and distill out of that. So really appreciate what you've both done this afternoon, and all strength to you for the future.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everybody for listening. It's been a good workout. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Take care now. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.